Hi, it's Alex here, and I am coming to you today with a screencast of the presentation and the short talk that I gave at the Transforming STEM lecture series earlier in the week. And I know that some of you were able to make it, some of you were not, and even those who were able to make it didn't hear the whole thing because I got cut off a little bit before I wanted to end. So I thought I'd put up this screencast to give you a fuller perspective on it because I think it actually is an interesting part of our discussion that we can be having around globalization and the curriculum. Because when it comes to globalization, we often think in terms of a crisis. And this is a way to think about how those global comparisons and global policy borrowing and other things that might be happening that are influencing curriculum worldwide maybe are a little different than they might appear. The number one question I usually get asked at events like the one the other night, or when I'm speaking to people who find out for the first time that I am a professor and doing what I do, is I get asked, how can Americans fix our failing education system? And I think the people who ask me that really expect to hear like this five-step plan for making it all better. And it'd probably be a lot easier if I could just list 5 things to change that would make some sort of immediate improvement. But honestly, after 20 years of working in education, I, and perhaps like many of you, know that there are really better questions to ask. And I don't want that to sound snotty because that's not the way I mean it. But the question I always think of when I'm asked that question is, why are people asking me this? Why is the baseline expectation that American education and STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education in particular, why are people asking it, or why are people expecting that to be failing in the US? And how do we move beyond the rhetoric of crisis and really make changes that matter? Well, I already mentioned that I began, or maybe I didn't mention, but I've been in this business now for about 20 years. And I started out as a classroom teacher in Japanese junior high schools, and then I came back to the US and was a high school teacher in Aztec, New Mexico. And that was a great way to start, I think, because in the 1990s, which is when I started out, Americans still thought that Japanese schools and students had an advantage. The Japanese economy was growing faster than the US economy, and their students and schools were outperforming Americans by significant margins on internationally comparative tests. Pardon me. But really, coming from Japanese schools back to American schools gave me some insights into what some significant differences were between the two systems. And more importantly, I quickly found that my experience in the Japanese educational system honestly lost some value as the Japanese economy declined throughout the 1990s. In other words, STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education, is truly vital. I'm not debating that. But the crisis about STEM education seems to be as much a figment of political and economic agenda as it is of educational reality. So, coming back from Japan, several differences stood out. One, Japanese classrooms were student stable. By the way, here's what the classrooms look like, meaning that students stay in the same classroom all day and teachers move around from class to class, the opposite of what we do here in the US. Uh, Students in Japan were organized within their classrooms by groups called Hans, and they did most of their assignments working as groups cooperatively, as opposed to a more individually focused approach of American educators. And third, Japanese students were really, truly excellent test takers. They could repeat facts just to a degree I'd never seen. But they seemed to struggle quite a bit with unscripted situations and problems, as opposed to American students who seem to prefer those unscripted problems. And my point is this, is that, and this may seem simplistic, but the Japanese way, those 3 characteristics I just mentioned, really worked for the Japanese. But it wasn't the American way. And when I came back to the US, that was actually a striking revelation for me. And I thought about it quite a bit, and it's part of the reason why I think I went into this field. And the upshot of all of this is that it has become increasingly obvious through the research that I do and that others have done that the key to learning from international comparisons is understanding which school and which non-school factors align to make good things happen. And that's kind of where I want to take us over the course of this talk. So as we begin talking, or as I begin talking to you about transforming STEM, I want to begin by talking about how STEM education is characterized in the American national discourse and kind of get at what the culture of STEM education is in the U.S. And then what the importance of school and non-school factors are in transforming it. So, although the history of crisis in the United States education system is long and storied, there are a few moments that usually get highlighted. One is the Sputnik crisis of the 1950s, and the fact that the Soviets were beating us in the space race was enough to push national attention and a whole lot of funding for STEM education. But the rhetoric of STEM education crisis really took hold in the American national sort of conversation in the early 1980s with the Reagan administration's publication of A Nation at Risk. And the language of crisis certainly wasn't subtle. And I'm quoting here, right? If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. Right? That's really interesting. We have in effect been committing an act of unthinking unilateral educational disarmament. Holy smoke. I mean, this is how education gets siloed in the national conversation and then blamed and shamed for perceived national underperformance. And every presidential administration since Reagan has made education both a focal point for political and economic crisis statements, but also a kind of platform for further political and economic agendas. For example, No Child Left Behind. I mean, President Bush's No Child Left Behind has been debated and discussed probably most of your lifetimes, those of you who are watching the screencast. And as this quote from President Bush suggests, you know, basically saying that American educators were just cranking people out of a school system, as if it was a big factory model and it was depersonalized, and STEM education in particular really had no place. It was just sort of pushing people through a system. And nobody gets off the hook. Even President Obama has some skin in the game, right? He said point blank that this, being, I guess, January 25th, 2011, this is our generation's Sputnik moment, and that we need to out-innovate, out-educate, and out-build the rest of the world. And the emphasis, both implied and overt, from all of these national agenda examples, it's not on the arts, it's not on the humanities, it's squarely placed on the shoulders of STEM education. And the implication over and over again is that America's schools and teachers are failing to prepare generations of American youth who are qualified and competent enough to take up the reins and be the next great generation to propel science and technology and engineering and mathematics forward in the U.S. for the sake of the country and the economy. I mean, it pulls on all the right sort of strings. The media has certainly been more than happy to sell this story. You've no doubt heard the journalism maxim that if it bleeds, it leads. And the same is really true for education stories as well. Crisis in education always comes before, you know, the positive stories. But if we're going to be truly excellent educators in a country that aspires to greatness, then we do need to push forward and improve STEM education. I don't think anybody's debating whether or not that's the case. The question is how to do it. And as President Obama's science advisor John Holdren said, America needs a world-class STEM workforce to address the grand challenges of the 21st century. Now, whatever those challenges are, he lists some in this quote here, but whatever those challenges are, Mr. Holdren is correct. We do need an excellent STEM education system in the U.S. The problem, as I've already said, is trying to decide what that looks like and how we know when we see it, or how do we create it. Remember that the United States is the largest decentralized system in the world. Unlike most other countries, the U.S. Constitution provides no mandate for educational provision or opportunity. That's left almost entirely up to the individual states, whose own state constitutions provide the right to and responsibility for education in the U.S. Yet when we think about the quality and provision of STEM education nationwide, we often ignore state variations and we concentrate instead on national averages in student performance. And when we do so, we do it on a pretty grand scale. Now, there are several international assessments of math and science education worldwide. The best known and most referenced are one of two, though. They're either the PISA, P-I-S-A, which stands for Program for International Student Assessment. It's overseen by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is based in Paris and has definitely an economics focus on why math and science are important. And the other one is the TIMSS, the TIMSS, that's the one that's on the screen right now, the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, which is overseen by the IEA, which stands for the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, which has been based in Amsterdam. I think it might have moved its base to New Zealand lately, but I'll have to check on that. And I'm focusing on TIMSS for a couple of reasons. One, it's the oldest. It's been around the longest. The U.S. has participated in it the most. Also, approximately 70 different countries and educational systems participate in TIMSS nowadays, including the U.S. And the TIMSS has become really one of the most recognized markers of internationally comparative educational performance that there is. Now, you may have seen or heard about how well the U.S. is or isn't doing relative to other countries' educational systems, either in the news or at a meeting or in a class or somewhere else. And rankings like this one, I know it's hard to read, I'm not expecting you to read all of these. Rankings like this one, though, are often analyzed in detail by those who put a lot of stock in ranking achievement scores. But the fact of the matter is this: there really are three groups of countries based on student achievement. There are those that are significantly above the international mean. There are those that are significantly below the international mean. And then there's the rest of us that aren't significantly different from one another or the international mean. And it's the same in both math and science. Those countries that appear at the top of the rankings generally get the most attention from concerned policymakers and others. And these are the so-called model systems. For example, at the top of the TIMSS Science Achievement Score rankings are Singapore, Korea, and Finland. And in our search for evidence-based best practices information about STEM education in the U.S., the teacher prep, the curriculum, and the way that the curriculum is delivered in the classroom in these countries, these three in particular, are often examined in great detail by researchers in the hopes that it's going to influence American educational policy and practice. And each of these three national education systems really have become famous for particular characteristics of their educational systems that Americans seem to admire. And that is where I will pick up on the next screencast.